Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 30 and 31. So let's begin. All for One smiled at the woman talking to him. Her name was Shuffen. She was telling him how her company could definitely keep his supplied. He already knew that, but it was expected that he attend these business functions. It helped to seal the deal. In some ways he preferred the underworld. Then if things went wrong, they could be dealt with directly, rather than with delicate excuses uttered while sipping champagne surrounded by artwork. Still, he had agreed to this function because his target was here. This wing of the gallery was beautiful, and to anyone interested in Song Dynasty art, this was the place to be. Except almost no one was interested. The connections offered here by the people were far more interesting. It was slightly amusing to him that amidst all the finery here, it would be considered uncouth to actually make a deal. He was here for that though, and was tracking his target. It was slightly difficult with all the people, given that he'd never really needed to do this much. He should have thought about it earlier and perhaps gotten a quirk to help. No matter, it was something he could look into later. For now, he had one eye covertly on his target, who was beginning to show signs of boredom with the function. He should be able to complete his transaction shortly. Weiji, it's so good to see you. All for One looked at the man who came over. It took him a moment to recall who they were. Yi Yuan. He greeted the man. Interestingly, Shuffen didn't look happy. Her company was a supplier, Yi Yuan's business was a client, so there was no clash of interest there. In fact, All for One thought that they had a separate business deal as well. So why was she unhappy? Oh. She hadn't seriously been trying to get him into bed, had she? The ancient man almost laughed at that thought, but let it go as he focused on Yi Yuan's words. We have a new project you may be interested in, he said in a conspiratorial whisper, which basically meant everyone in a 5-meter radius could hear. We are always interested, Yi Yuan, you know that. The opportunity to work with you is welcomed. Yi Yuan beamed at him. Come to my office tomorrow, and we'll discuss it? All for One suggested. Now that Yi Yuan had told everyone about the opportunity, that was probably what he wanted anyway. Of course. I trust things are going well? The usual, he told Yi Yuan. Shareholders wanting profit now, forgetting that you need to invest. That was a standard complaint. Surely not, Weiji. Shuffen objected. It was a simpering objection and confirmed his earlier thought. All for One gave her a slightly condescending smile. Be thankful you are the sole owner, he told her. Dealing with shareholders is exhausting. He added with a chuckle, that Yi Yuan echoed. On paper, his company had shareholders, but 80% of them were his other shell companies. 20% were actually legitimate, but he had employees who dealt with that aspect of the company, and they made sure the business was run according to the law. From the corner of his eye, All for One saw his target move away, and if you weren't looking for it, the slight opening of the door would be missed. He was looking for it, but no one else was, so even those in the vicinity of the door didn't notice. Yi Yuan, we shall chat tomorrow, All for One said when he deemed enough time had passed. Shuffen, it is, as always, it was lovely to see you. Let me know if there is anything I can do to help you, he added by way of parting. Shuffen's face flashed with annoyance, but she was a businesswoman first. And she smoothed it out and nodded, giving him what she thought was a seductive smile. The same applies, she murmured. Anything, Waiju, anything, came the extra emphasis. Yi Yuan nodded at him, and as All for One moved away, he heard Yi Yuan and Shuffen strike up their own conversation. He activated a small quirk he'd come across. It was useful in situations like this. The quirk had a childish name of Hideaway, but that wasn't what it did. The quirk simply encouraged people not to notice him. People saw him and avoided him, but they just didn't register his presence. Not properly. If you asked them later if they had seen him, they'd say yes, and then wonder how they'd missed him. He used it now to move smoothly across the room and let himself through the door he had observed his target using. The corridor beyond was dark, and Hisashi kept the quirk up. It would be best if he could approach his quarry without him being startled. He added an extra quirk so that he could see in the dark. Most people thought he only liked huge flashy combat quirks, but some of the smaller ones, with more pointed uses, did come in handy, not just in combat. Radar vision was useful in many situations, not just when the room was filled with tear gas, as the previous holder had utilized it. But it was not a quirk he needed now. He moved along the corridor but already knew where his target would be. There was a patch of night sky visible at the end of the corridor from the large bay windows there. The boy would be there, not stuck in one of the rooms that adorned the corridor. He was too young for a romantic liaison. All for One moved silently and paused, just out of the light to find his quarry. The boy hadn't tried to go outside and was sitting in the feeble starlight looking out at the garden. "You can go outside, you know," All for One said softly. The boy jumped and whirled around to look at him. He plastered a smile on his face and held out his hands. "I didn't mean to startle you," All for One said. The boy looked at him. All for One saw the way his eyes assessed his garments. "The party is rather boring," he commented, confirming what the child should already know. He wasn't one of the gallery's security guards. He didn't have on their uniform and he was dressed in the ubiquitous suit that the male partygoers had been wearing. The boy had black hair, and black eyes with narrow, inwardly set eyebrows. "It is," came the soft reply. The voice was high-pitched, but then the child was only 8. "Like his Izuku. Shall we go into the gardens then?" All for One invited. He had some time, and if he could get the child into the garden, then there were more scenarios that could be played out. Or rather, more scenarios that the police could make up to explain why Hiryu had been in the garden. "Who are you?" "My name is Hao Shoutzu," he introduced himself, picking the name randomly. He wasn't planning on having the boy remember him, and his Ouija alias should be safe enough, but there was no need to take chances. "And you are?" "Hiryu Rin," came the soft reply. "Well then, Hiryu, why don't we go into the gardens?" "The door is locked," the boy told him. "I think I can fix that," All for One said conspiratorially, reaching out to grasp the handle. The door was locked, and alarmed, but if you made it appear as if it was opened with the key, then the alarm wouldn't go off. There might be a log that it was opened, but that wasn't important. He swung open the door. "Is that your quirk?" Hiryu asked him. He winked but didn't deny it. "What is your quirk?" All for One asked as the Hiryu ran onto the small balcony that was outside. There was a set of stairs that then went down to the ornate garden, which, by the smell, just had the grass mowed. Darn. He didn't want to risk getting grass on his shoes. While it was doubtful anyone would notice, there might be some with enhanced senses who would smell the grass and then wonder why he'd been outside. He walked to the edge of the balcony and sat on the balustrade. "My quirk is scales," Hiryu told him excitedly, taking the hint and sitting with him. "Do you want to see?" "I would love to see it," All for One exclaimed. Hiryu pushed out his arm and rolled up his sleeve, and then a frown appeared on his features before his arm was covered in scales. All for One grinned, and made sure the expression could be seen in the low light. He reached out, making sure to telegraph his movements, and poked at the scales. "That's fantastic." Hiryu smiled at him. "I can also launch them," he told the older man. "Launch them?" This wasn't an aspect of Hiryu's quirk he'd been aware of. The boy looked around. "I can't do it here," he said slowly. "But they propel like little bullets." "Amazing," All for One said. He meant it, and before Hiryu could do anything more than give him another smile, his other hand flew out and grasped the boy's head. All for One activated his quirk and grabbed the light green glow that was Hiryu's quirk. Under his hand, Hiryu's eyes rolled back, and All for One caught him as he lost consciousness. He laid the boy down on the balcony and activated another of his quirks. Memory change. As carefully as he could, because there was no need to be overly cruel, Hisashi erased the last 10 minutes from Hiryu's mind. Extremely short-term memory was a very nebulous thing, and All for One hoped he'd gotten enough. It was a difficult, and he didn't want to erase too much. Honestly, if he possessed Giran's quirk, it would have been easier, but Juhin had trained Giran well and he was a good broker. He rose and looked down at Hiryu. "Thank you," he told the unconscious boy, because there was no need to be rude. The night air wasn't cool enough that the boy would be in any real danger, and at the gallery, there were no large dangerous animals. He'd be safe enough until found. The door was still open as well, so if he was not found before he woke up, he could still let himself in. All for One walked away, activating a slight strength quirk to jump over several balconies to another doorway. He opened the door and went back to the party. He had an alibi to attend to now. The light and warmth of the party was almost blinding compared to the dark and chill of the night, but Hisashi smiled as he re-entered the room, keeping his presence muted with hideaway until he was well away from the entry. Then he let the quirk drop. "Ouija, where have you been?" The cry was almost instantaneous, and All for One smiled as he turned to the man. Ambassador Thurkel, he greeted the man. I've been talking with my business partners, he gave the excuse. Tut. The ambassador waved one hand to dismiss the question. Tonight is for celebration, to look at art. Not for business, he said. Now that he had Izuku's gift, all for one nodded. I couldn't agree more, he smiled. What can you tell me about this piece? He asked, gesturing to the silk scroll on the wall behind them, knowing that the ambassador was one of the few people genuinely interested in Song Dynasty artwork. Ah, that one, the ambassador gushed. Hisashi let the words roll over him as he plucked a glass of mediocre champagne from one of the passing waitstaff who was doing an excellent job of balancing several trays on their limbs. A quirk was definitely in use there. It had been a productive night. Mrs. Shuyona pressed submit on the form with a certain amount of glee. Hisashi Rigi thought he was so smart. He thought he had everything under control. Well, he might control the minister, but he didn't control the bureaucracy. And even if he had her complaint dismissed, which she fully expected to happen, he couldn't erase the memory of it in the workers who had passed it up the chain. And he'd made it so very easy for her to report an anomaly. Izuku Kawa had been enrolled in a new elementary school in Saitama Prefecture, at her school's expense, and it had taken some very creative adjustment of the books to hide that, but he had been enrolled as Izuku Inpei. He'd also supposedly gained a quirk. Fireproofing. Ha! A quirk that was stupidly easy to test for, but one you would be accused of cruelty if you did. And one you couldn't prove that you had without demonstration. The first issue was that Inpei was not his name. She was beginning to suspect that Kawa was not his name either, but that wasn't the point. The change of name was the problem itself. Schools were instructed to look for such discrepancies. Teachers had to report if they suspected that a student's home life was bad. They were trained to recognize certain warning signs and to flag them with the school and the education department. She was simply doing that. The quirk was the second issue. Maybe Izuku did have that quirk. Maybe they'd only found out about it now. But then he should have been enrolled in her school as quirk unknown, rather than quirkless. She couldn't access the records which would confirm Izuku was truly quirkless, but others could. If he was really quirkless, and the fireproofing quirk label had been added merely to make his life easier, well, that was another issue, and falsifying official government records had hefty penalties. Unfortunately, it was not something she could prove at her level. Oh, Mrs. Shuyona had no doubt that the minister would suppress her complaint, or bury it, or make it go away somehow, but if he tried to have her fired, well, he'd be in for a fight. How would it look to fire the principal who had raised the suspicion of child trafficking? She could play this any number of ways which would work to her benefit. And of course, she was simply trying to keep government documents accurate. But she fully suspected nothing would happen immediately, but it was the little things that would trip up people. And it was her fond hope that this would be a little thing. Beneath Hisashi Rigi's notice. He'd trip though. On the name, or the quirk registry. And from there, it was a long fall. It was autumn, but the weather had been relatively dry, and despite the chill in the air, they were taking the opportunity to eat lunch outside. Izuku knew that Shigeru and Naoki were a bit wary of Hitoshi, but they sat with them anyway, so that was something. The problem with it being autumn was that everyone was crowded onto the tarpaulins that had been placed out. That way they didn't get muddy feet, but it did mean that no conversation was private. Izuku was talking with his group of friends, but he couldn't help but hear other conversations, and he was noticing a theme. He frowned as he ate the bento Kurogiri had made. Naoki sighed. "What is it, Izuku?" he asked. "Nothing," he replied. "It is something," Shinsu drawled. "You've been frowning for the last 5 minutes." The purple-haired boy had already finished his lunch and was sitting with them. He wasn't that tired today. Izuku worried at his lower lip. "It's about Setsuna," he said. "Oh yeah, she finished first at the Kanto regional trials on the weekend," Naoki said with a shrug. He nodded. "No one seems happy about that though," Izuku observed. Shigeru sighed. "You really don't get it, do you?" "He doesn't," Hitoshi answered. "I don't get what?" Izuku demanded. Naoki looked upwards, as if asking the gods for strength. "You explain," he told Shigeru. Shigeru gave him a grumpy look but eventually nodded. The other boy put down his chopsticks and shifted so that he was looking directly at Izuku. He sighed, and for a moment Izuku wondered if Shigeru was like Hitoshi. The purple-haired boy sighed a lot too. Setsuna is great at sports, Shigeru said. And she's already training to be a hero, but Shigeru sighed again. She's not very nice, he finished. Naoki nodded. Sometimes I wish I had her quirk, he said. But Finder is so useful. Izuku objected. Not to become a hero, Naoki grumbled. Since when do you want to be a hero? Hitoshi asked with a surprising amount of acerbicness for an 8-year-old. That's not the point, Naoki snapped back. Her quirk is great, but she's painful. That was practically the words Izuku had been overhearing from others. He resolved to talk to Shinsu after school. So, do you like her or not? He pressed the question. Naoki and Shigeru shared a glance. We like her, but her quirk is great, but what? Izuku demanded. She's not that great, Naoki said after a rather loaded pause. Izuku nodded and let the matter drop. Has anyone been able to play Super Mario Odyssey 22? He asked to change the topic. He still had the Nintendo Stitch Mate XL Lite that Tomura had given him, and this year he had found out that others had them as well. It was nice to be able to talk about games to someone who wasn't Tomura. Shigeru grinned, the previous conversation forgotten, while Hitoshi groaned. Just the beginning, the other boy said excitedly, picking up his chopsticks again to finish his lunch. Izuku smiled. He still had questions, but for now, this was more fun. Izuku walked beside Hitoshi as they made their way home. It wasn't that they didn't talk, it's just sometimes they enjoyed each other's company in silence. So why were you asking about Setsuna? Hitoshi asked. Today wasn't going to be a silent walk home. Izuku took a few more steps before he answered. I was curious, he said. Everyone says he stopped. That wasn't what he meant to say. It's just that he stopped again. He didn't really know how to say this. Hitoshi glanced over at him. It's hard to explain, Izuku said finally. Even for an 8-year-old it was difficult to explain what he felt. Try again then, Hitoshi encouraged. Heroes are meant to be good people, Izuku began again, backtracking slightly. Yes, Hitoshi drawled. Izuku's opening statement was obvious. Setsuna is training to be a hero. That's true, Hitoshi agreed. But no one likes her. No one thinks she's a good person. So if she becomes a hero, then how can she be good? Izuku concluded with the question. Hitoshi grunted. They walked for a bit more. You see, I just don't get it, Izuku said. Well, heroes are just people, Hitoshi said. Izuku looked at him. That was what Gargoyle had told him. It's what Kurogiri had confirmed. Heroes were meant to be good people, but if Setsuna was training to be a hero, then there was a fair chance she would become a hero. This wasn't the same as the other kids in his previous school. The odds were against them. No one trained from this age if they didn't have a chance. Which would mean that Setsuna could become a hero without being a good person. He had seen what she was like, briefly. Others confirmed her actions. Why was she training to be a hero then? Shouldn't someone like Naoki become a hero? Finder was a good quirk. He could find anything you could give him a model of. He wasn't interested in being a hero, but he was a nicer person. Izuku sighed. He wanted to believe that heroes were good people, but when a hero told you they existed to maintain the status quo, and when you could see that someone training to be a hero wasn't a good person, nothing made sense. Maybe she'll get better? Hitoshi suggested, though Izuku could hear the doubt in his voice. Maybe, Izuku agreed absently. Hitoshi reached up to scratch at his hair. I don't know what to say, Izuku. He consoled his friend. It's okay, Izuku agreed. So what did you think of Odyssey? He asked with a grin. Hitoshi heaved a sigh. You know what I think of it. He replied. He'd been playing it when he came over to visit. Yeah, and you actually got ahead of me. Izuku told him. I still don't get how that happened, Hitoshi said. I've been busy, Izuku replied. He had been busy. Kurogiri had been testing his situational awareness while he was training. That was tiring. He could do one or the other, but when he was training he couldn't seem to combine them, and the Misty Man kept startling him. It was hard work, but he felt as if he was making some progress, and Kurogiri wasn't disappointed in him. He explained that Izuku was doing this very young. Obviously, Hitoshi drawled. Well, the levels get better, he explained. Oh. How? Izuku asked. You'll have to find out. Hitoshi answered, but had the sense to run ahead with that pronouncement. Izuku blinked and then grinned as he ran after his friend. Things would work out. He was sure of that. I have a lead, Mirai told Yagi as soon as the other man came into the room. A lead? The pro-hero known as All Might was shocked, but Mirai could hear the hope in his voice. It's a couple of weeks old, but that's better than anything we've had so far. Toshinori finished his sentence. What is it? Mirai took over the projector and Yagi found himself looking at the image of a young boy. The child didn't have green hair. So it wasn't the kid All For One had kidnapped from his mother, the kid who might be his son. Who's this? Hiryu Rin, Mirai gave the child's name. All Might didn't even have to ask how Hiryu was a lead. His quirk is gone, Mirai said. And there is no medical reason for it. So that's why it's a few weeks old, Toshinori nodded. Children sometimes had trouble using their quirks and wouldn't for days or weeks at a time. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that it had taken a fair amount of time to actually diagnose that the quirk was truly gone and it wasn't just a childhood ailment. His quirk was scales. A serviceable quirk but not one in his usual interest range. What does it do? Allows him to generate scales over his skin, and to use them as projectiles. From the tests I've been able to run on one of the scales that the parents had, they aren't that strong. Yagi frowned. That didn't sound like All For One. The man took quirks, yes, but he tended to only take the strongest quirks. This one sounded useful, but if the scales weren't that strong, then there were other quirks which would be better suited. Let's ignore the suitability of the quirk for the moment, Toshinori said. It was entirely possible that All For One didn't realize the quirk's weakness, and that could only be a good thing for them. Why do you think it's him? His sidekick gave him a look. There's always a chance that it's not him, he said. I know, but you wouldn't have brought this to my attention if you didn't think it was. True. Mirai flashed another photo up on the projector. This time Yagi saw Hiryu standing with two people who had to be his parents. It took him a moment to see that they were very well dressed. The Rins are well off, Sir Nightai told him. As such, their son has had quite a few scans done recently. One is of his quirk factor itself. That's reliable? Toshinori asked. He recalled someone asking him, or rather All Might, to have that scan done and had decided the question fell into the range of questions about One For All, and had politely deflected it. Not completely but reliable enough, Mirai said, especially because they have a before scan. And that confirms the quirk is gone? His sidekick nodded, and brought up another image. This displayed two graphs. Toshinori didn't know exactly what was being graphed, but while their scales and color schemes were the same, the results were noticeably different. We know so little about quirks, and the concept of becoming quirkless is not one people want to contemplate. The stupid would say that if you become quirkless, you will gain a toe joint. Mirai rolled his eyes at the statement. He knew that wasn't the case. All Might sighed. That's the accepted diagnosis technique for quirklessness, he reminded his sidekick. Yes, but you just aren't going to grow a new joint. Mirai objected. All For One doesn't work like that, Yagi reminded Mirai. True, and it is the results of the scan that lead me to believe this is actually All For One, he said. There is a definite change in Hiru's quirk factor and he cannot use his quirk anymore. So when did it happen? Yagi asked, pushing aside any joy he felt at the possibility of having a lead. This was not how he wanted to find All For One. But if he was honest with himself, he really couldn't think of any other way to find the fiend. 3 weeks ago, at a gala that the Rins really had no right to attend. All Might gave Sir Nightai a look. His sidekick did not back down. They are well off, but they are not that well off, Mirai defended his statement. This was a gala for ambassadors, ministers and multi-billion businesspeople. They aren't there yet. Plus, Hiryu was found unconscious on one of the balconies with no clear memory of how he got there. That was a bit of a giveaway. The authorities concluded that he had wandered away from the party, and gotten out of an unlocked door, and fallen asleep there, but that isn't right. Toshinori nodded. That wasn't right, but at the same time it didn't really matter how he'd gotten there. It was obvious that was where All For One had taken his quirk. Who was at this gala? Events like that had guest lists. And while it was obvious that All For One would be using an assumed name, that name was something which could be tracked. Mirai pulled up another slide. It was of many headshots. Too many to see the people clearly. I've taken the liberty of removing those who it simply couldn't be, he explained, flipping up another slide. There were fewer headshots this time and each photo was accompanied by a name. It leaves this many, he said. It's unlikely to be the women, All Might said. He had never heard of All for One posing as anything but a successful businessman. And it won't be any ambassador, he added. Mirai tapped at his computer, and the slide changed. Again there were fewer images. I think we can work with this, he said, looking at the list. Do you recognize any of the names? All Might took a few moments to read them. Some were Chinese and the Chinese kanji were written with the Japanese. Most were the same but a few were different. This one seems suspicious, he said, pointing at one. The kanji didn't match the pronunciation hiragana. Sir Night-Eye brought up the image. All Might stared at it. The image was most definitely not All for One. The man, All Might assumed it was a man, had a mutation quirk. His head was not the normal human design. He had a speckled skin and a huge mouth, topped by beady eyes. There were 6 fringed tendrils rising from his head. That's not him, Yagi said unnecessarily. True, Mirai agreed, the name is good though. Yes, unknown would be something he'd call himself. He'd think it funny. Who else is there? They spent the next hour going through the other candidates and when none of them were All for One, the two of them flipped through the rest of the guest list. None of the images even came close to looking like All for One. You ran them through recognition software? Yagi asked. Mirai nodded. While they couldn't access civilian databases, you could compare images to one you had. No match, he confirmed. But we know he was there? Toshinori said. Mirai nodded again. They were 99% sure that All for One had been at the event. There was always a slight chance he hadn't been but that didn't fit the evidence. Yagi sighed. How sure are you that the images are correct? He asked. What do you mean? Names to faces, Yagi said. How sure are you that you have the right faces for each image? He clarified his question. Very, Mirai sounded offended. Toshinori shook his head. Could you sort the images based on quirk type? He asked. I don't have that information. Sir Night-Eye said. Then let's sort mutant quirk type against the others, he said. It was true, you couldn't tell what type of quirk someone had from an image and even those who looked as if they had mutant quirk types often had an emitter quirk completely unrelated to their looks. There was a flash of understanding in his sidekick's eyes and Yagi watched as Mirai ran through some internal calculations. There's only one, he said and tapped some keys on his computer. The slide that had all the guests appeared again but then the headshots moved. One remained to the side. Just the one? Yagi pushed. Just the one, Mirai confirmed. Toshinori sighed. You can't change the world, Mirai reminded him, talking about the prejudice inherent in the conclusion that there was only one. Some countries had a marked prejudice against those who displayed any mutant look, even if they had an emitter quirk. Those with mutant features fared badly. Yagi sighed again. Let's confirm this image then, he said. He didn't like the prejudice, but if he could use it. No. Usefulness did not make it better but it was not something he could deal with here. Mirai was typing something. Toshinori watched as several browser windows opened and his sidekick worked his way through several websites. Well, Sir Night-Eye said eventually. This man does exist, but his name is not Ouija. He tapped the screen again to bring up the man with the mutant quirk. All might read the new name caption. Pedro Axolotl. Next to his picture, there was an empty space, with the name Ouija Fumenu below it. So who is Ouija? All Might asked slowly. It was odd. He felt almost afraid. As if this lead would disappear. I don't know, Mirai said tightly. The name exists. There is paperwork but I cannot find any visual evidence of him. A very, very small smile creased his features. Yagi bit the inside of his lip to avoid returning it too widely. He glared at the empty space above the name Ouija. There was a long way to go. He couldn't say the words yet but maybe one day. Maybe one day he would look back to this moment and know it was the beginning of the end. He would know this was the moment they had him. He hoped. End chapters 30 and 31, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.